My name is Chime Asonye. I'm the founder of an organization, Nigeria Mental Health. I'm a policy advisor that focuses on international development, on social impact, and on Africa. And I'm really excited for today's conversation, which is on unlocking Africa for Africans. This event is co-organized by Marikai Afrique, the Young African Leaders Program at the EUI School of Transnational Governance and the Migration Policy Center at EUI's Robert Schuman Center. There's also, we really want to give great congratulations to some other of our partners, GIZ African Union, the African Union Youth Ambassadors for the Free Movement of Persons in Africa, the Independent Continental Youth Advisory Council on the AFCTA, and all other individuals that helped make today's event possible. Today, we'll be talking about the African Union, which has been a really critical driving force in promoting regional integration across the continent. And we've seen it with the adoption of very revolutionary instruments, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area and also the Free Movement Persons Protocol. However, when we think about these groundbreaking achievements that are supposed to connect the continent, a lot of times we don't think about how these challenges or impacts or opportunities impact or relate to our everyday lives. The general public usually doesn't really understand what these new instruments do. And so this session is to demystify the practical implications of these free movement protocol, these issues of trade for our everyday lives. We want to discuss how we can think about easing travel across the continent for our work, tourism, studies. People mentioned the different parts of the world they are. We also want to think about the potential challenges and opportunities based on some of these new instruments. And our organizers and us who are working today hope that it will make these instruments and these topics more tangible and accessible to our audience. So how will the program of events go today? We'll be doing the welcome, and then we're going to have individuals who help put together a policy brief on this, discuss a little bit about their brief and the issues. Then we're going to bring different people from different parts of the continent to discuss how, in a moderated panel conversation, how we can think about trade, how we can think about free movement, how we think about migration from the various perspectives. Then we're going to open it up to the audience. You guys have already done a great job by asking some of the thoughts and questions you want highlighted in the conversation. Please keep those conversations going in the chat because we'll highlight some of those discussions, some of your thoughts. And then we want to have individuals discuss what their own personal narratives and stories are when it comes to this issue of trade, unlocking Africa, unlocking migration. And then finally, we'll round it up. The last thing I'll say before we start this conversation is that we have many people here from different parts of the world, but we want to make sure that this conversation does not just stay within the four corners of your computer screen. If you can take pictures, you can tweet insights at two hashtags that we're using. One is hashtag AUFMP, which is basically AU's free movement protocol. So AUFMP, I'll put that in chat. And the second chat hashtag we're using is Travel Africa. That's hashtag Travel Africa. So if you see something informative and you want to tweet about it, you want to share about it on social media or anything like that, please use those hashtags so we can follow along the conversation with you. That's hashtag AUFMP and hashtag Travel Africa. And I'll put those in the chat. Now, with that said, I wanted to bring up our next speaker to give us a formal welcome. Can we welcome to the platform, and you guys can do a digital applause, for instance, Marahai from the Migration Policy Center of the EUI's Robert Schuman Center. Mahari?
Yes, thank you, Chima. Thank you, Chime, for this introduction. And I'm very, very glad I'm joining you to this webinar event, though it's virtual, very, very important, on a very important topic. I want first to start with my appreciation as academic coordinator of the Young African Leaders Program and associated also as part-time professor with the Migration Policy Center. And I have colleagues here, including one of the deputy director of the Migration Policy Center with us. But I want to start first with my appreciation to the partners who have supported this initiative, but above all, also to those who have initiated this webinar itself, the conceptualization and implementation, including yourself, but Tenny, Selindile, and also Verdict, who have been at the forefront of this initiative. And I hope this will be a fruitful discussion. The importance of the topic, I want to mention a few words, is no doubt an important topic, no doubt with impact on the African continent, potentially also globally. We know, I think colleagues will be delving into the details. Data-driven presentation will be followed up by after these opening remarks. But I want to emphasize on three very important points that could help frame the discussion. First, free movement of persons as a free movement of goods, services, has been at the core of the aspirations of many Pan-Africanists. Free movement of persons has been one of the important elements that the Pan-African agenda has been promoting. And you will find it in many of the instruments the African Union has, not only the recent free movement protocol itself, but also the Abuja 1991 Treaty, the AU Constitutive Act, and previous charters that we have. At the core of this is to allow Africans to move freely between countries and without these borders that has been imposed by colonial masters. So an aspect of this Pan-Africanism, Pan-African movement, is the fact that colonial borders have been imposed on Africa and has also stalled the development of Africa, broadly speaking, economic, political, and other aspects of cultural development of Africa. One way of undoing colonial legacy is to reduce the impact of colonial borders through free movement of persons, in addition to other free movement of goods and services. So it has this decolonization aspect, which I think the new generation, most of you belong, has to keep it close, hold it fast, and promote it. So it's a very important topic from a decolonization perspective. But beyond that, the new mandate of the African Union, as you know, has been on two pillars: the integrationist mandate and the interventionist mandate. The integrationist mandate is about free movement of goods, services, and people. At the center, the movement of people will be at the center. Of course, the interventionist mandate has to be about peace and security and intervention on situations when they arise under Article 4 of the AU Constitutive Act, which mandates the African Union to intervene. And but this focus on the integrationist, and this is a tool of integrations, this integrationist mandate. So it's also well located with the AU mandate, if you wish, beyond the Pan-Africanist mandate of undoing colonial borders. Now, the third element, apart from the mandate of AU, it is developmental. This has to be framed as a development question. Free movement is about economic prosperity, about trade, about culture. So development defined broadly. And the African question in most areas that we delve, even contemporary debate that we have, are about development. And how do we ensure Africa is out of the development trap that it has been since independence? And one instrument that we have is the African Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement. An aspect of that is the free movement of persons, and a very important aspect that we need to look. So we have to frame it as a developmental issue, a development for Africa. And it has, of course, implications for trade. It implication for informal cross-border trade, not only the formal ones, which are catered most often through our instrument. So there are important aspects here where young people, women, and those in peripheries, which are marginalized, also have will benefit from this as a developmental project, if you wish. So as a developmental project, we need to also frame it as not only the past or a legalistic mandate of the AU, but as economic, trade, and other development, cultural development that we want to seek. The last point I want to raise, perhaps as a framing point, is implementation. At the center of our initiative has to be implementation, implementation, implementation. There is nothing that is basically undermining all of our initiatives. The free trade protocol, the free movement protocol is not exception. It is a victim of this lack of implementation at member states level, especially. And it starts with ratification. We have the least ratification for this protocol, and the ratification has to be brought up to the level where it becomes effective, and the number has to increase as fast as possible. Some of the treaties in the AU have gone to effect faster, and there is a possibility of doing this also for the free movement protocol. And in this regard, I would say ultimately implementation, the alpha and omega of implementation are member states. And we have to hold them accountable to implement this free movement protocol once they ratified. Of course, we have to also mobilize constituency that support free movement of persons, and the constituencies should be identified clearly where their interest is. Where there is no long-term sustainable interest, such initiatives fizzle down and they are not sustainable. So we have to identify the areas of interest for different diverse groups and hold fast to those and push this agenda forward so that member states are obliged and accounted in terms of implementation of this protocol. With those few remarks, I would like to welcome you again, all of you, to this conversation, and I hand over to you for the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those interesting comments. You highlighted four amazing things. One was about, which I don't really think about, which is the Pan-African agenda and its connection to deconstructing colonial borders. A lot of times when we think about this, we just think about it as a trade or development issues, but we don't think about it as an equity issue, thinking about it with the past of colonial. You mentioned integration interventionists with the free movement of people and the peace and security. Also, important development is key, not making it legalistic, and also implementation. And I think that resonates with a comment that we got from the chat from Maka, who talks about she's curious about trade and infrastructure on the continent. She's actually planning a road trip to West Africa. So this point of this session is not just to make it legalistic, but also to deep dive about how it impacts and affects everyday people. And to give us some of that framing of context, we're going to bring it to our authors chat. Individuals who have worked to put some of this policy together. We have Penny, we have Celindy, we have Marcel. We're going to invite them on stage to give us a little bit of context about the work they've done to frame this conversation on the African Union and on the Free Movement Protocol. Welcome, Tenny.
Thank you, Chime. So, I mean, it's an online event, and the reality is that with online events, in many of our countries in Africa, because I'm speaking from Nigeria at the moment, it can be quite tricky with the connection. So I know Celindile is struggling with her connection. I know Marcel is as well, but then Celindile, are you there? And Marcel?
Yes, I'm here.
I'm here.
Okay, that's brilliant.
Tenny.
Yeah, yes, I can hear you too. Okay. So, I mean, we'll just go right ahead with the authors chat, and it's a very informal chat. So, Celindile, Marshall, and I, as well as other members of our group worked on a policy brief around the Free Movement Protocol in Africa, or by the African Union. And then we're just going to give you, some context about as to why we worked on that policy brief and what our thinking was around it. The policy brief was part of our fellowship at the EUI with the Young African Leaders Program. The fellowship was administered by the School of Transnational Governance. So maybe I'll just start with this question, Sandile and Marcel. When I think I brought up the topic of the Free Movements Protocol, what was your initial reaction to the topic? Perhaps Selindile.
So I think I'm going to, when you brought up this topic, it was very new. It was the same for every member of our, and we were like, okay, this is a new topic, why not explore? That's where we started reading and asking people about within this area. It was new to me, but to push forward.
Yeah. Sandile, are you there?
Yes, I am here, and I hope you can see me and hear me. I think for me it was quite interesting, especially as someone who's working in the migration space, because I had heard more about the Free Trade Area Agreement more than the Free Movement Protocol. So when Tenny brought it up, it was, interesting for me because I was coming from a space where it's not spoken a lot about, and I think it makes sense given the context that, Southern Africa is one of the regions that has a lot of countries that are resistant to the adoption of the FMP. So it got me interested in the sense of asking, why are we not talking about this? Why aren't more people in the migration space, within my context anyway, speaking about this? And as I was researching, even among the academic scholarship, there were a few people, I came across people like Alan Hesh and Mihari, and that got me even more interested to say, what role can I play in making sure I, enhance the efforts that are already being done by the AU, because this is a very important protocol. And I think, like we always say, we can't push the Free Trade Area Agreement without also speaking about the Free Movement Protocol, because, goods move with people. So that's where my interest was, activated.
Yeah. I think it was similar for me. So I'd always been interested in intra-Africa travel. I studied in Ghana for my undergrad. And even before I went to university in Ghana, I used to go by road from Nigeria to Ghana, so going through Benin and Togo. And then I was just fascinated by the idea of crossing borders in Africa. And of course, I had an experience, last year or 2 years ago, which I'll share later, where I was denied entry into a country. So finding out that the African Union had an instrument to ease intra-Africa travel was very interesting to me, and I thought it was worth exploring. So Marcel, I want to come back to you, hoping your internet is still steady. I know you took a very steep learning curve, because in the process of researching this paper, as you said, you almost became an expert on the FMP, so you can even break down the different sections. Maybe you can just summarize what you found in your research about the FMP, just for our audience, just to get a quick explainer on what it tries to do or what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I cannot call myself in this field. Actually, I'm still it's a process actually. Started reading about. I apologize for those who really understand my accent. Speaking country. I figured out that first of all there were two when it comes to cross-border transaction traffic. So first there was the African Free Trade Area Protocol, the free movement of persons. So I figured out that strangely, the free movement of good was the protocol of the of good was compared to the of person. So I was like, possible. Why can let goods go is good to go across borders and not accepting or allowing to go freely through. But then I went on and read the movement of person, and I figured out that the road it is to travel with visa on, but later on, people even to settle down and have equal access to jobs and you know opportunities as from the country. So when I started to go and hear how people are in this protocol, and you know how people some countries like many countries in West Africa, for instance, Nigeria, West African countries, a little bit ahead of some other is in Africa when it comes to allowing people to go to arrive in a country on arrival. So yes, if you ask me or where are we going, Prof. Mehari has already said all. It's advocating, and you know, people. It's not when we are the free movement protocol, not just opening our border, going to you know and understanding what comes with it. If you ask me, Tenny, very much.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Silindile, I hope you're still with us.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just handing over to you, because the interesting thing is that out of all of us that worked on this brief, you're the only migration expert. And also you were the one that led the charge of seeing it through to publication, because most of us wrote it and we were happy to be done with it after we met the requirements of the fellowship. But then you pushed through in terms of getting it ready for publication. So over to you. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just turned
Okay,
off my
over to you.
camera. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I didn't get the last end of your question or statement.
Yeah, I was saying that, you know, out of the, you know, circa 7 of us that worked on the policy brief, you're the only migrations expert. And then you also felt it was important for us to publish the brief, because after working on the brief, many of us were ready to call it a day and move on to something else. But then you led the charge of getting it ready for publication, and now it's been published, and now we have this event. So maybe just to share some of your own thoughts and what you hope to achieve with pushing it through. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me
Okay.
now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, like I mentioned before that for me it was a bit concerning being in the academic space, why a lot of people are not writing about this or are not talking about it. I mean, my center, the African Center for Migration, has done some work on free movement in SADC and the East African Bloc. But I thought, as a young person, as a young academic, where is my voice in all of this? And how many people out there are not really aware of this free movement protocol. And I think a policy brief was a good way to kind of break down these difficult concepts or try and unpack the free movement for the person on the ground who can read it and be able to grasp it, unlike reading an academic article on the free movement. So I think that's why I pushed it, because I felt that it is important to include young people. But at the same time, I think we had this conversation, Tenny, that how do we move from research to action, right? And I think that is what inspired the, this webinar. But I think above and beyond that, it was more an interest in ensuring that young people's voices are heard. Because I think when we talk about Agenda 2063, most of the people who are pioneering Agenda 2063, will be old or might not be here. So it is important for young people to insert their voices. And I think coming from an academic perspective is to say also doing it in a realistic way, because we also have to be critical about some of the things that we put out there, considering the context in which we are operating in, and how do we even begin to think about free movement in relation to the realities that are happening in each countries in Africa. And working from a South African space, and even coming from Botswana, I know that the topic of free movement is silenced because we're already grasping with issues of xenophobic violence, and that is related to people grappling for resources on the ground, and this scapegoating on foreign national, and the lack of political will that has also led to anti-migrant policies, right? So how do you even, thinking about how do we broach these topics in context like this? Because yes, the provisions of the FNP are well and good, but I think we also cannot be removed from the realities on the ground, that in as much as we are pushing for this, but we also have to ensure that we are localizing some of the provisions, looking at what is happening in each of the African states. So I think maybe to quickly sum up is to say, for me, I was passionate about my voice as a young person in this, and ensuring that conversations don't end in technical, corridors, or us as experts talking about this, but how can I ensure that a young person in Botswana who's an informal trader who moves from South Africa to Botswana buying goods gets a buy-in to say, opening up borders works for me, but also having a voice in terms of what does opening up borders mean? How does it affect me? And what role can I play in ensuring that my government is signing in, or there's a buy-in from my end? So I think that is the gist of what sort of like motivated my involvement. But I'll be interested in your sort of like experiences, I think, maybe to wrap up the session, as somebody who's working in the trade and policy space. I mean, you did mention that you broached this topic to the group, but what really inspired it? And like we always say, there's more support for the free trade area agreement more than the FMP. And I think our policy brief clearly outlines that, some of the issues. Where do you see the disconnect? And as somebody who's a trade expert, what do you think can be done to ensure that, we are pushing the free trade area agreement in conjunction with the FNP? And what role can young people play in this process?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindile. So, like you said, I work in the trade policy space, and I think people are increasingly realizing that you can't have a free trade area without some level of mobility, because with free trade areas, typically, the gains are distributed, or the gains are not distributed evenly. So some countries may be better off than others in the short to medium term. And one way that you can try to balance for that is mobility. So if, for example, Ghana becomes the hub of chocolate production, it doesn't mean that everyone that produces chocolate in Nigeria or Cameroon should be out of a job. They should be able to move to Ghana and partake in the industry there. So we do need some level of mobility of labor, also of students, because at the moment, a lot of us are sending out a lot of money of foreign currency to import education from other parts of the world. And then, of course, for business and for trade. So it's very relevant there. And I think for me, it's just, I'm interested in regional integration from different perspectives. So my master's dissertation was on the single currency in ECOWAS. I just like the idea of doing things together especially as Africa, given our history, so just coming together to pull our resources, pull our strengths, and then to become something better than what we are at or where we are at currently. And I guess to wrap up this author session, something that you mentioned, Solindile, so we were saying that we need to start going from research to action. So we worked on that policy brief and we had 3 key recommendations. And one of the recommendations was public awareness. So we said, okay, I mean, with the little resources that we have, perhaps you can contribute to increasing the public's awareness of the FMP. So we're hoping to also do a series of activities beyond this webinar, just to engage, say, the younger generation, because the FMP is a technical instrument, but then what it's trying to achieve, which is easing intra-Africa travel, is not technical. It's very relatable to every single person. So we're hoping that everyone here will join us on this journey. So also to even take the message to your network, to your friends, to your family, to say that we need to support this agreement. But like Sindili said, still recognizing that there are challenges within countries already that we need to try to address. So it would be good to wrap up this author's chat now so that we can get to the exciting bits. I mean, first of all, I know we'll hear from Martin before the panel discussion. But do you have any last words, say, Marcel or Solindile? So, Marcel, do you have any would you like to add anything before we close the session?
I'm good.
Okay, all right. And Solindile?
No, I think I've covered everything, but I think, like I've always said when I talk about this topic, that achieving the free movement of persons involves all stakeholders. It's basically all hands on deck, and it requires the involvement of everybody from civil society to member states to the local person on the ground. So I think we need to start thinking about how to engage different stakeholders and their expertise to ensure that we realize, free movement within Africa.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So handing over back to you now, Chime.
I was on mute. Thank you so much. We really appreciate. I think, can we give them a virtual clap for really not only setting the agenda for us, but setting the context and putting together the policy brief. So if you guys can do a virtual clap or put some icons in the chat, let us know that we appreciate their good work. Some key themes were mentioned there, and it was something that was emphasized from our welcome speaker and the author's panel conversation, was this one around political will being important of localizing. And so I really like the fact that we're talking about localizing, and we're going to bring an international perspective and perspectives in our next talk from across the continent. The other thing I was going to mention is that Tenny mentioned that there was 3 key recommendations from their policy brief, and one of them was public awareness. And I think when we talk about decolonizing and amplifying Africa for Africans, we need to be great. We need to honor the fact that we're taking these policy briefs and turning into. We need these actions in order to form equity and work. So really, let's give them a round of applause for that work and effort. Tenny, you mentioned 3 recommendations. There's 3 recommendations, and you said that there was just one that you mentioned was public awareness. I think it would be great if you get a chance to put the link to the policy brief maybe in the chat. So if individuals want to learn more about the policy recommendations, learn more about the policy brief, then we can engage in that, and we can understand some of these core contexts and research that they did on these important issues. With that, let's go to our next speaker for our first localized / international perspective. We have Martin Roos from the Migration Policy Center of the EUI to give us a bit of broader context and perspective on this important issue. Welcome, Martin.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you for inviting me to be here today. All right. Well, hello, everybody. As Chime said, I'm based at the Migration Policy Center at the EUI in Florence in Italy, where we do research on different types of migration flows and experiences around the world, including free movement within Europe. And today I've been asked to share some experiences of free movement in the European Union. I'm given 5 minutes, so I'll try to be brief and I'll be very selective. But I'll just start maybe by saying something very obvious, which is that context really matters. I mean, we often, or at least kind of as part of my work, I'm often asked to compare different free movement areas around the world, or to try to draw out lessons from one area for another area. But one very fundamental point is that what people mean by free movement differs actually significantly across regions of the world. So, so in the European Union, the free movement of persons is one of the fundamental freedoms of the EU. So along with the kind of free movement of goods, capital, and services, people, and by people I mean EU citizens, can move freely within the European Union. So the second point, which I've already tried to highlight here, is that when we talk about free movement of persons in the EU, we're fundamentally and primarily talking about citizens of an EU country. And one of the points I want to make at the end is, what does free movement of EU citizens within the EU, how does that affect actually the European Union's migration policies? So how the European Union treats people from outside the free movement area. I should also say, maybe just a kind of a short note on terminology. It's quite interesting that most institutions of the European Union, like the European Commission, when they talk about free movement within the EU, they do not talk about migration. They choose the word mobility. So even though technically I, as an Austrian, I'm now in Italy and I'm a migrant. If you take a UN definition of what constitutes migration within the EU language and terminology, I'm a mobile EU citizen. So I'm exercising my rights to free movement. And of course, that choice of terminology is something that reflects also a desire to take free movement of EU citizens out of the kind of very highly contested migration debates that we have in Europe. Okay, so what does free movement of persons mean? Well, it basically means that, you know, citizens can move freely across EU borders, and that it can do all kinds of things. They can go and study in another EU country. They can go and work. They can bring their family. And I want to spend quite a lot of my time talking about labor migration. So that means the free movement of EU workers. So what does that mean? Well, it means that, as I said, I, as an Austrian, I can choose to go to any other EU country and apply for a job. And if I get a job, then I can just work. So I don't need a work permit. I don't need a special residence permit. I don't need to ask anybody for permission if I can go or not. I can just do it. Interestingly, if I qualify as a worker, that basically means I have to meet certain criteria about how long whether I do a full-time job or a part-time job, then I'm also eligible to receive the same welfare benefits and services that citizens of that country have. So what free movement of workers means is that there's unrestricted movement of workers, but these workers, if they're employed, they also enjoy all the welfare benefits that are available in the host country and access to services. So that in the international context, that is something quite unusual. And by and large, if you look at opinion polls and ask European citizens what's good about the European Union, they will say that, well, free movement is one, or the right to free movement is one of the most beneficial things. We have to distinguish a little bit, because of course, when you ask people about how they think about free movement, it means various things. It's about your own rights. So I enjoy my right to go to somewhere else, but it's of course about other people's rights to move to wherever you are. And that second part, by and large, has also been supported, but free movement has become, or aspects of it have become, politically contested in certain areas in recent years. And I just want to mention those as well. So in general, I mean, free movement has brought enormous benefits to the people who move themselves, but also to host countries and also benefits to sending countries. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there have been some contestations and some areas that have been more conflicted recently. So one issue I already mentioned is while nobody, no major politician that I know of has proposed kind of restricting the free movement of labor, there have been concerns about access to welfare benefits. And that's mainly because different countries have different kinds of welfare systems. So you have different types of national welfare systems. And that has led to debates about whether or not kind of equal access to welfare states doesn't perhaps create more difficulties in one country than in another. So that's an area that has been discussed. And I think the kind of a more general question here that always arises with any kind of transnational policy is, to what extent are there differences between the countries, institutional differences between the countries, so different types of labor markets, different types of legal political, and to what extent do these differences challenge common policy making? A second area where there has been some debate in recent years is there have been concerns about brain drain. And because free movement has meant that there has been a lot of intra-EU labor mobility, but there has been in particular a lot of movement from east to west. And there have been quite a few member states of the European Union in Central and Eastern Europe that have lost a large number of young, highly skilled workers. And that has generated debates about what does that mean for those countries when actually significant numbers leave. And the final point I want to make is that, again, it's an obvious point, but we talk about free movement, and that means kind of erasing mobility barriers for people that benefit from that free movement areas. But in the European Union, at least, it has also meant that often strengthening barriers to immigration from outside the free movement areas. And actually, many of you will be, of course, very familiar with the very difficult political debates we have about immigration in Europe in recent years. And there are many politicians who actually argue that the only way you can have free mobility within Europe is to actually have very strong borders to the rest of the world. And so I think it is important that that we keep in mind that as you create a free movement area, you're getting rid of some barriers, and that benefits many people. But at the same time, you're potentially also creating new barriers for people outside that free movement area. So I think all of this needs to be transparent, and it's very important that is also part of the debate. So thank you. With that, I think I'll finish here.
Thank you so much. That international context is really, really important for a couple of reasons. And I like how you said context matters. So it's good that we got that international context before we dive into local context. A couple of things that stuck out for me. One is you mentioned the question of discourse in terms of how the distinction between using mobility versus migration. And I think that's something we need to think about, especially as Africans, in terms of getting and wading into this debate. What are the terms? What is the rhetoric? What is the discourse that we use if we want to highlight certain things that we think is important to shape public opinion and increase adoption? So it's very, very important that we think about the discourse and what potentially policymakers should be using. The second thing you mentioned was that one of the top things that the EU individuals like is around free movement. I'm sure if you polled Africans, it's one of the top things would not be free movement. It's not, probably wouldn't be in the top of the agenda. There might be other issues. So how do we raise it on the public agenda? And what does that mean in terms of framing? And how do we get ahead of some of these conversations that have been challenges in Europe, whether it's brain drain, welfare, and things like that? So we have a distinguished panels from all over the continent that'll help us unpack and wade into these conversations and questions. The first individual that I would like to introduce is Amina, who's a doctoral research fellow at the Institute of Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome, Amina, to the stage. Then we'll have Poppy. Poppy is a South African travel vlogger who has found her purpose in edutainment. The aim of Poppy's brand is to entertain, educate, and inspire in a way that is fun, challenges the viewer's way of thinking. Welcome, Poppy, to the stage. Next, we have from Cameroon, Minnie Fong, who's the CEO and co-founder of Bongolo, a homegrown booking platform that connects travelers to affordable, comfortable, and most convenient accommodation options across Africa. So essentially, Africa's Airbnb. And then we have Mayoga at the top, Tola Oyemi. We're both Abuja Global Shapers. He's the CEO and co-founder of NoriBase and also served as Nigeria's assistant chief trade negotiator. He helped design and negotiate the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which helps connect a single market for Africa's 1.2 billion individuals. So Tola, welcome to the stage if you are here. Welcome, everybody. How's everybody doing today?
I am here. I don't know if I'm in focus. Ah, found.
There we go. Ogami, well done, sir.
I'm loyal, my peeps. How are you doing?
I'm good. So really welcome to the stage. And I actually want to start by asking all of you guys the same question. We're here talking about free movement protocol. We're here talking about traveling across Africa. So can you just each tell us what has been your personal experience in terms of highlights, opportunities, challenging of just crossing borders in Africa? And anyone can start the conversation. Just what has been your personal experience of traveling across borders, highlights, challenges, and things like that?
Since everyone has been quiet, I can go first. Travel's a strong part of my life, right? And anyone that knows me knows this. I think so far I've been to about 85 to 90 countries around the world. So like travel's a big part of the running joke I say is if God made 194 countries, I think he wants us to see all of them. So I generally like to travel and see the world, and it's also a big part of work. I'm an international lawyer, which means I advise countries and corporations on international trade, and I also run a company that helps you do business around the world. So it means a big part of also business for me is about seeing the world and traveling the world. And traveling in Africa is hard. Right, so it's just hard, right? I think I was reading data this morning preparing for this that says that Africans enjoy more restrictions traveling within Africa than even Europeans and North Americans, right? So even within the African continent, if you're African, it's harder to travel than if you were just like American or European, right? And actually, there's also data that says that there's restrictions. There's up to 60 restrictions. Africans only have access. Africans have visa restrictions for about 60% of the African country, right? So like almost nobody has more coverage than 40%. And that's like horrible when you think of it. And I'll give context, right? So I have to go a lot to South Africa for work or carry and even Kenya, which is supposed to be one of the places that has good visa policies. But even with Kenya, you have to apply for an e-visa for as a Nigerian in advance, which means that I can't spontaneously just pick up my bag and run into Kenya. I need to plan for days in advance. And it happens a lot. And I know Chime and most people here would have examples where you're in Europe, your classmates or your friends, and they're like, "Oh, let's go to Tanzania for the weekend." And you're like, I kind of need a visa, right? And your friends who are Americans or Europeans are coming to Africa and don't even need a visa. And so it's hard. It's hard because not only does it affect access to work. So for instance, I have friends who say things like they just pick up tickets and go to a country and go scout for partners. You can't do that as an African, right? Because even in applying for the visa, you need to show that you have a ticket. You need to show that you know what you're going to do. You have to have in some cases, you have to have an invitation letter saying that I'm inviting you to come to the country. In some cases, you need to have an hotel, right? You can't just be spontaneous. You can't, and that affects your economic capacity to do business. It affects your ability to travel and see the world. It affects your ability to see friends, affects your ability to communicate, to stay in interaction with friends. And interestingly, I make a joke that I actually enjoy traveling more in Europe than I do in Africa, because I can get one Schengen and I can just travel to all the countries in Europe, right? But in Africa, I need to get visas everywhere. Like even the East African visa is supposed to be one of the most progressive ones, still is hard to get. And when you do get it, usually it's only Kenya, I think Tanzania, Uganda, and then you're stuck. The rest of them you still have to apply. So it means if I want to see 54 African countries, and I have a friend who's trying to do that now, you need to apply for so many visas that at some point you ask yourself, is it really worth it, right? Because it means you need to apply for upwards of 40 visas if you're Nigerian just to travel across the continent. And the question is that worth it? And another thing which is also a bit dehumanizing is the fact that in some cases, they'll tell you, if you have a visa to the US or the UK or the EU, you can travel to my country, right? And it's weird because like I'm traveling within Africa, but I need to show that I have a visa to the US, the UK, or the EU to be able to travel within the continent. And I think a bunch of countries have that happening. And now I've been lucky for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that because I worked on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I tend to travel on a note verbal a number of times. I get to travel. And even and when I do that, I just see the comfort of what it would look like if the passport actually worked, right? Because what happens with the note verbal is you just arrive at the border, show the note verbal saying, oh, I'm traveling on behalf with the AFCFTO, I'm traveling with my government. And they say, oh, visa on arrival. And I'm like, why can't I just do that all the time? Just get a visa on arrival and land all the time. The last two things I would say, and before I hand over to other people to talk about their experience in traveling, is at the time we're negotiating the AFCFTA, one of the things that were tabled to get signed at the same time was this actual protocol movement of people. It was tabled at the same time, right? And one of the pushbacks we got from a lot of governments was that there was a lot of resistance within the continent to allowing people travel, to allowing free movement of people. So more African countries were willing to sign the AFCFTA agreement, because it was in the same meeting, it was the same Kigali meeting. They were willing to sign the AFCFTA agreement, but were less willing to sign the free movement of people agreement. And I think one of the things that I push back a lot is this notion of free movement. I think maybe that's one of the politics of language. I think using the word free movement assumes that it's some dash, you're dashing people's stuff. I think maybe we need to find better words to use. Maybe not call it free movement, maybe call it rightful movement. Maybe, I don't know what we need to call it. But I think the idea of this whole logic of free movement makes it look like it's some guy you're giving a benefit to, as against the fact that it's people who actually have economic interest that want. And when you think of it, the order of travel on the continent is already incredibly high. The cost of tickets on the continent is astronomically expensive. The connection on the continent is expensive already. It's difficult already. Most times to travel within the continent, you need to travel out of the continent back into the continent. Nigeria and Niger are side by side. And to travel from Nigeria to Niger, I need to almost sometimes travel all the way to France. Sometimes I have to travel to 2 countries before I can get into Niger. Now, with all that order, most people are not randomly trying to just get into new countries. They're traveling either because they have business concerns or they have family concerns. And so this whole pervasive notion that by allowing border access, you're suddenly going to have an avalanche of people showing up in your country is not proven. And it's not proven for a number of reasons. A clear example of why it's not proven is Rwanda. Rwanda today has a visa on arrival. And it's still very well controlled. It doesn't have an avalanche of people just running into the country. Kenya has a progressive type system where you can most times apply visas online, and it still works. So I think this notion is not backed by data that you need to keep people out, keep Africans out from being able to travel within the country. Just some of my thoughts that's my experience around traveling so far.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to take this on? What about your personal experiences traveling on the continent?
So I find that most immigrants. Oh yes, I'm on. Okay, I find that the movement of information from the higher ups to the immigration officers who actually work at the borders is not good. A lot of the time, so I do mostly road travel across Africa, and I find that a lot of the time immigration officers don't know the visa laws. So they, for instance, in Gabon, they didn't know that I can be in Gabon visa free for up to 30 days. I had to tell them. So, there's a lack of information. Also, I find that borders in Africa are meant to keep people out. So they're not really trying to let us in. For instance, I get grilled a lot. Why are you here? As a previous speaker, mentioned, why are you here? Who's hosting you? Do you have an invitation letter? Do you have accommodation up front? In Gabon, when I entered, I told the immigration officer that I'm here to visit a friend. I gave him the friend's name and number and address, which is usually enough. And he sat there and called my friend, so there's this suspicion of travelers at our borders, which I absolutely hate. And then last but not least, forced bribes. There's a lot of forced bribes, a lot of corruption at our borders. For instance, in almost all borders, you have to, they try to make you pay for a stamp. to get a stamp in your passport, which I always say, no, I'm not paying. But not everyone has the courage to speak up against an immigration officer, because maybe it might mean that then you don't get into the country, so you just pay. Sometimes they'll charge you to sign your name in a bogus register. It's a lot of crazy things. So it's not a good experience at all right now.
Thank you. Amina or Minafong, do you guys have any thoughts about your personal experiences?
Yeah.
I'll go last.
On a personal note, I think it's not any way far from what the other two panelists have spoken about. On a personal note, okay, I've been across about 12 African countries so far, even before starting my travel company that we work still. And one of the biggest challenges, even at the company level, is still about travel restrictions, visas, the trouble people face in crossing borders across Africa. So on a personal note, one of the worst experience I've had was when I was traveling to Uganda sometime in 2018 from Rwanda. I took a bus, and you know the EAC has this policy of if you're a resident in one of the countries, Uganda, Kenya, or Rwanda, you can definitely go to the others with just an interstate pass. So when I got to the Gatuna border in Uganda, I was allowed to enter. I was allowed to exit from Rwanda, most definitely, where I was given the interstate pass. But when I got to the side of Uganda, I was delayed there, and actually the bus that I boarded left me there because the immigration officer wanted me to pay bribe, obviously, for something that is supposed to be free. So that delayed me basically for going across, and which is not supposed to be so. And still, when you get to the border at Busia from Kampala to Nairobi, you get similar experiences from immigration officers, and it's quite, you know, very frustrating in most cases. You see all of that happening, so you tend to realize that going across Europe, it becomes even easier, just like Tola said earlier. And it's frustrating going across different, borders in Africa. The same thing applies for countries in the CEMAC zone. You hear of the possibility of you traveling as a CEMAC resident or, citizen of the CEMAC countries to other CEMAC countries, basically, but that is not even feasible. I remember in 2014, I had a challenge in Equatorial Guinea where I traveled there as a Cameroonian with a Cameroonian passport. I was literally repatriated from Equatorial Guinea just because I didn't have a visa. I said, but how do you need a visa again to get into a country that is actually supposed to be on a free, inter-travel? So I believe that the challenges really are still strong on borders, and more especially you have treaties signed, but the just like Poppy said, the experience on the ground is totally something different. I also remember a friend expressed it to me that they brought some Americans to Nigeria some time ago, and then they got to the airport. These people had to pay even 2 million naira in bribe, but these people were still very much denied entry into Nigeria even after collecting such monies. So personally, these are different challenges that we go through trying to cross borders across Africa. So we get to worry about why is it so much so, but still there are still greater countries that put things in place to make sure that these things do not happen. Like Rwanda, for example, where I've lived for over 5 years, I get to have people coming to Rwanda every day. Personally, you can literally just pick your passport and buy a ticket and fly to Rwanda as an African with an African. So if they can do it, why are other countries not able to do it? Which is interesting to me. And other countries are kind of relaxing the policies. You talk of Ghana, they started with the visa on arrival as well. But why visas, basically? Why can we not just travel across Africa if we hold passports? And so these are some things that we come across. And I'm happy to, expand more in course of the conversation across the challenges that we face as a company, and also, what is restricting people from really making efforts to cross, borders across Africa. So, yeah, I think I will just leave it here for Amina too.
Thank you, Munafong. We have two shout outs for Rwanda from Tola and from Munafong. So there's doing something right, something we really want to zero in on. Amina, what has been your personal experiences?
Well, I guess it's very similar to what Poppy, Tola, and Minifong have said. I think for me, the border really scares me, both in Africa and elsewhere, mainly because I remember I had an incident in 2019. Actually, I was trying to go to Ethiopia, and my connection flight was through Italy, and I wasn't allowed to board the flight because I didn't have a Schengen visa, and they said that I was a risk passenger. They've received like all these information about me, and I think since then it just becomes a realization that we don't all travel the same way. But I think for me it's just so important to also acknowledge that we're tapping into this conversation from a standpoint of privilege, because I'm afraid of the border because I've heard dehumanizing stories while interning at the UNHCR like a few years back, and it was mainly about people who are trafficked across the continent and who cross borders and really risk their lives in the process. Getting a visa to South Africa took 6 months. And I guess everybody understands the challenge of trying to get access to this part of the continent. But having lived in Mauritius, Senegal, and South Africa now, I think it's just been really interesting navigating how you are welcomed into the space. But I think for me, it almost feels like what's happening on the continent is that the surveillance in Europe is actually mimicked on the continent. So our bodies are surveilled as Africans by African governments in the same ways that Europe wants to. And it's this whole idea of, I think as Tola said, what does it mean for people to move and what's happening within this idea of like free movement? And I think, I mean, having grown up and lived in Morocco, it's also interesting to see sort of how Blackness is experienced and how Black people experience being in Morocco and also on that part of the continent. So this last weekend, I was in Johannesburg and I met a South African friend of mine, and he told me that he was in Cairo and he was so surprised and so delighted to see Black Egyptians. And in my head, I'm like, if I had told you, you would have not believed me. So I think this whole distortion of what is happening in North Africa and in the southern parts needs to unravel more. And I think I had more ideas to share about representation and how do we on the continent sort of see each other and through which mediums. And I think it's just great to see someone like Poppy really, enlarging the possibilities of how a body can move across the continent. And yeah, it almost seems that our African bodies are always expected to undergo a lot more difficulties, or supposed to sort of go to an elsewhere, which is Europe, in order to learn and become modern, but to never come to the southern parts of the continent. And for me, I really see it as a sort of disobedient mobility that we should all be engaged in, as a way of emancipation and as a decolonization kind of praxis. Yeah, I think overall the border still scares me, and I don't think I'm as courageous to sort of cross it each time, mainly because I'm scared of being dehumanized or being sort of basically.
Thank you, Amina, so much. You said so many good things there. And I actually want to focus on this. I want you to speak again because you said that there were some things you want to highlight in terms of some thoughts in the context of representation and things like that. And because of your kind of like situatedness, we have these historic, I've always thought about this, I've never traveled to North Africa. And I'm not sure why. When I think about traveling, I think about Kenya and Tanzania and things like that. I don't think about the North. And it's really because of this historical and colonial divide between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and how we are represented, whether in terms of the regional dichotomies and challenges, but also what some of the policymakers say. We saw something from the Tunisian president quite recently that talked about migrants from South Africa that were considered racist, Black Africans and things like that, from organizations like Amnesty International. So when you explore your identity as a North African, what would you say about these representational practice, their impact on African travel and migration? Is there, the international perspective said we should be exploring discourse, representation, and identity. So what will your recommendations be there based on these distinctions?
That's a very, very spot on question. Okay, so I think we've all been following the one-sidedness or the one-sided story that CNN, BBC have been highlighting when it comes to the Palestinian genocide that's being done by Israel. And I think that's just one example of how we've come to understand how different parts of the continent look like through CNN and Western media. So when I did my undergrad, it was in Mauritius. It was part of a Pan-African university. We were from all across the continent, but we still had, those very typical stereotypes about one another that, you'd expect from a white person who's never traveled or who's never left their American sort of little town to say like, oh, do you ride camels, or what kind of meat do you eat? And I think that was really interesting in terms of just understanding how do we come to know about one another and what kind of mediums shape our gaze towards the different parts of the continent. And I don't know if you're familiar with Binyavanga Wainaina's essay on how to write about Africa, which I really recommend. It's a very satiric essay to read, but it's really spot on about, how Western media really shapes our gaze towards one another. And I don't know if I have sort of suggestions but for me, it's to really educate yourself about what different parts on the continent look like, and to actually allow yourself to be surprised and to acknowledge your ignorance. So when I went to Nigeria last year, I was very surprised that Abuja was green, mainly because I never imagined Abuja to be a city with that amount of trees. And I think I just had to take a step back and really acknowledge that, it never goes away. It's a continuous exercise. You constantly need to think about it. But when it comes to this idea of the border, it seems that the northern part of the continent is doing the dirty job of Europe, which is keeping the migrants out. And it is that rhetoric that is really reflected in politicians' speeches. There's a lot of massacres and genocide that we don't hear about, and I'm glad that some of them, come out on social media, like what happened in Libya, in Morocco, and in Tunisia. And I think it's really important to keep talking about them. But I think that idea that the North is white and that the South is Black is a really distorted idea of history and a whitewashing of Africa in order to keep the southern border white. And, it's really an ethnic cleansing in a way. And yeah, I think those are some of the thoughts that I've been reading about. But I think we need to acknowledge that in South Africa, I come across sometimes as South African. And I continue to tell people that you all with me on this call would also come across as Moroccans. And so how can we actually shift this discourse of what you look like based on where you are? It's actually something that needs to be dislocated. But I think, I just have one last point, if that's okay.
No problem.
Part of that, post-colonial thinking that we're still stuck in is thinking that on the continent, or how I've been raised in Morocco, is this idea that we're not good enough, and the modern world is elsewhere, and you need to go to gain value as a human, because unless you don't move to the north, you're dehumanized. You need to gain a language, you need to speak in a particular way, you need to know particular orthodox theories. So I think the idea that needs to be dismantled is how to regain value, or how to see value in the places that you come from. And you don't have to agree with everything that happens in the places that you come from. You can belong and not belong in different ways. But I think we just need to make peace with the idea that we are human and we are valued, and South-South migration actually is the largest migration that happens in the world, more than South to North migration. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I don't think a lot of people know that South-South migration is bigger than North-South. So that's a very important part. I want to go back to Tola since you let us off. You have this really interesting startup, right? Nori Base. And I mean, and the idea is to establish businesses everywhere on the continent and to help facilitate trade. So a lot of times we think about these ideas as distinct and dichotomous, free movement as distinct, trade as distinct, etc. But can you, through your experiences, kind of help link these concepts together? Free trade, intra-African investment, travel, etc., and how your startup is helping kind of link those things together? You're on mute, by the way.
Thanks. That's a very helpful question. So I think it's a number of things. So one of it is that one of the imperatives for, and it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, right? But it's that usually one of the big things you need to see happen for, okay, how do I explain this? People need to be able to travel to do trade, right? If they can, and the reason is simple, right? Like, and it's for two reasons. One of them is there's a low trust on the continent. It's just what it is, right? Like, and because there's a low trust on the continent, that's all. A lot of it is historical, a lot of it is political. A lot of it is also, like you said, colonial, right? So, for instance, there's a lot of issues. Can I trust people from West Africa? Can I trust people from this country? All that stuff. And so it means that usually people want to be able to have some kind of actual relationship before they actually do transactions, right? So people want to travel, do transactions. And so it means that usually you notice that places that have a lot of trade connections and human connections tend to have a lot of trade. So for instance, because a lot of Nigerians went to school in the UK or went to school in the US, you see that a lot of our business, our trade happens with the US. You'll also see that now when it is a lot of travel within Nigeria and China, Nigeria and India, there's a lot of business happening between Nigeria and India, Nigeria and China. It's just like, it just follows, right? Because people want to touch someone, want to interact with someone. No one is trying to send $1 million across the country without having seen the person you're sending $1 million to. All right, it's just like what it is. But at the same time, it's also that the more people do trade, the more trade routes start to create and travel routes start to create. And so it's almost what kind of happens is I have to be able to travel to a place frequently to start to send and do business there. Because usually what happens is that when I say something like, when I say on this call, I say something like, which of you know someone that can help me get 1,000 packs of steel? You're probably going to know someone from somewhere you've been to, right? And so that's kind of what happens. But the other side to it is that when you actually start to do business, then there is actually a better incentive to create travel routes. And this is what I mean. If more people start to travel to Nigeria and the UK, an airline would then say, oh, maybe we should go create a direct flight between Nigeria and London, right? Because a lot of people are traveling there and it just makes sense, right? Or someone will say, oh, right? But, and so it almost, and that's where most African countries are stuck. Because what happens is, because historically, a lot of our transactions, a lot of our interactions and travel used to be with people that we have colonial relationships with, that automatically means that's where we travel to the most. It automatically also means that's where we do the most trade with. And so when you say things like we want Pan-African trade, people need to be able to travel to those countries to actually try to do trade. If I don't go to Kenya, if I don't go to Uganda, for instance, today I travel to Kenya, I spend 4 months a year in Kenya, right? Because of that, it means that I have a worldview in Kenya. So when people say things like, well, I want to do a transaction in Nairobi or in Kenya, I know people to call, right? Because I've been there. I know flowers are a big deal there. I know agricultural products are a big deal there. Now, and so now, because of that, because of the increasing travel between Nigeria and Kenya, there's now more frequent flights between Nigeria and Kenya. And so what most African countries are facing in this case where, because we don't have historical travel relationships with a lot of these countries within the continent, a lot of trade doesn't happen. And because a lot of trade doesn't happen, we end up not even creating new routes. So today, more people trying to travel on the continent spend more time traveling outside the continent or spending time in lounges, just having 24 hours waiting time, 18 hours waiting time. And the cost is just prohibitively expensive because there's not a lot of frequency of travel. Today, for instance, I can give an example. Traveling from Nairobi to London, I can get a one-way ticket from Nairobi to London for as cheap as $200, $300. And the reason is just because Nairobi, London, Kenyan Airways frequency, In the same, now, Nairobi to London is about 9 hours, right? Traveling between Nigeria and, I don't know, Nairobi, or even Nigeria and Ghana is almost the same price, right? And this just makes no sense because of like, and it's a question of frequency of travel. How many people are traveling between Kenya and London every day, as against how many people are traveling between these routes every day? That's like one big question. The second thing I wanted to call out is that a number of times these distrusts are inflated and untrue. So today we do business across, and what Nobis does is he allows you to do business across the continent. So the idea is that why should I have to incur costs of traveling to a country to set up a business in that country? And the reason is that when you think of compliance and getting compliance across the world, there are like 4 things that matter to you. The first is you want to be able to set up a legal entity in that country to be able to have a legal entity. The second is you want to be able to receive payments in that country, right? Which you know, bank account. The third big thing is you need to buy and sell in that country. And lastly is that you sometimes want to be able to get access, whether it's travel access to those countries. Today, if you're an African, those things are prohibitively difficult for you to do. What Nobis tries to do is to say, can we abstract all those complications away from you and build a product that does all that? So today, we're not as cool as Minion Fong that helps you with travel. We help you more with actually the corporate infrastructure. So how do you set up your company? How do you get a bank account? How do you automate all your compliance in all those markets? And the idea is that we want people to be able to, because I shouldn't have to travel to a country 4 times before I can set up in the country. And 3 examples that come to mind very quickly. One of them is an example where someone tried to set up a company in Kenya, in South Africa. And this was an example. Got a big client in South Africa who said, oh, I'm ready to go in South Africa. I need to set up a country in South Africa. This person was Nigerian. Like Amina said, getting a visa to South Africa takes maybe what? God knows how many months, right? Maybe 3, 4, 5 months. So this person had tried applying to visas and was taking so long to get a visa. So he says, my customer is going, I'm going to lose my customer if I don't get a legal entity in South Africa. So he finds somebody online and says, can you create a South African company for me? Pays this person about $2,000 and this person runs away with the money. Money in the grain, no visa, stuck. And that's kind of the experience that most Africans deal with, right? You don't know, you're caught between the situation of I need a legal entity in the country, but I can't even go to the country to get a legal entity. And at the same time, paying someone I don't know on the internet is just risky, right? And that's kind of what we've come into breach, right? Which is basically saying you can come to one service across the world. And today we not only do the African, we're live in 58 countries, meaning all the 54 African countries, the US, the UK, BVI, and Dubai. And the reason is because those are major holding companies for most people. And then they can come to one platform and set up your business in all these markets and also be able to do transactions in all those markets, get bank accounts in all those markets, and more than even that, be able to automate your compliance, meaning your ongoing compliance. But the other thing I'll say is this. When people start to trade, and I think one thing that trade does for you is it brings out distrust. Trade brings down a lot of distrust. It's easy to distrust people and say, oh, but the more I do trade, and this is one of the most interesting things I learned, you hear people say things like, oh, I had this Nigerian friend who was my colleague who did these deals with me years ago. Great guy. He helped me do this. He helped me do that. Or I had a South African person. And the more you do trade, the more you hear these kind of stories. Real people doing interactions with people. Some people who've never had one person who said they'd done transactions with someone way over $10, $20 million, and they had never seen this person in their lives. Or a friend of a friend introduced them. And that's what trade does. Trade brings down those distrust that people have with each other because you actually realize that they're actually more good-hearted people doing real legitimate transactions across the continent than they are the 1-2 examples that are blown out of proportion, right? And what that does is it helps in policy making because what happens is, for instance, I've been in meetings where a policymaker is stuck and then someone tells him a story of somebody and he's like, oh, I know that person. And that brings down the barrier. Right? Because it's a question of I know somebody, I can humanize the person. And what happens a number of times is when we talk about trade and policy, it's numbers on a dashboard, not real people, right? So it's easy to think of it as saying, oh, Nigerians, Ghanaians, South Africans, Egyptians, but it's a lot harder to say Chime, Amina, right? Because those are real people that you can connect with, right? And what trade does is it allows put a human face to real people. It allows us to understand that there are real people behind this number, behind these policies that we make. When we make restrictive visa policies, when we make blanket restrictions of saying the whole country can't travel to our jurisdiction, when we say things like people have to bring prohibitive price, when we hike up price of flights, that there are real people behind these things. And that's what trade does. Because what trade does is the few things, my best analogy is this: you spend your time and your life trying to make money. So you can almost say that money is a kind of representation of what you spent your life doing, right? Getting, right? Because you're exchanging your time for money. And so a great extent of time, what people do with transactions is a very deep kind of activity. And it means that when people can do transactions with someone else across the continent and it goes each free, it builds more trust in that place. It builds a kinship in that place. And that's kind of how you think of it. So like I said, trade means people have more trust. Trade means people create more flight routes. Trade means people create more policies that actually work. Trade means people are less afraid of another jurisdiction. Trade means that people actually have cheaper ways because of economies of scale. And so in the end, it's almost lockstep. You want trade.
Thank you, Tola.
Yeah, you want trade and people together. Yeah.
Really, really amazing points. And I just want to see if we can quickly touch Poppy and Minifong before we open it up to the audience, because we're eating into their time. But Tola said something really important, Poppy, that trade is about people. It disrupts distrust and things like that. And so I'm just wondering how we can amplify that using new media platforms and things like that, right? You're an individual, and you know, I was reading about you, and you have these African travel narratives. You do intra-African travel. Can we use new media to kind of decrease this distrust? And also, how does that work in terms of enhancing the story based on the type of travel narratives that are being told? Because I know we have like a very elite vision of luxury travel, Cape Town and things like that, but your travel is a lot different. You know, I mean, it's in the grassroots, it's in the weeds, et cetera, like that. So how does those various stories and conceptions, as we think about it in relation to new media, help either complicate or enhance these narratives around inter-African travel?
Okay, so one way we can help to decrease distrust is to actually travel to these places. Those of us who can should travel Africa, and we should tell good stories about other African countries. Because then when we tell good stories, that's what people who watch us, who follow us have in mind. And so when someone comes across a Cameroonian or a Nigerian, then they remember the good story that Upopi told online on her platform. So it's very important that we do leave our South African bubble and go out into the rest of Africa, meet people, talk to them, see how they are living. There's a narrative that, you know, other Africans or every African wants to come to South Africa. And that's just not true. A lot of people are very happy in their home countries. I ask this all the time, you know, how's life in Accra? Are you happy here? And, you know, a lot of people are happy to be at home, to live in their home countries. They don't want to move. They don't care to move to South Africa. So that's one way that we can, you know, build trust is through stories. And then another way that we can use new media to amplify African travel and sort of make people want to travel Africa is brands can start to sponsor budget travelers more. So currently what brands are doing, travel brands, they want the shiny aesthetic, you know, the creators with the, what's that thing that flies? Drones, you know, the creators with the drones and all that shiny stuff. That's who they want to be associated with, because that's what they think it will make the most money. And that's simply not true. There is money in budget travel. There is an audience, there is a market in budget travel. So we need brands to open up their sponsorship to us as travel vloggers as well, travel budget content creators as well. So what this will do is it will encourage the luxury content creators to also explore a wide variety of travel options. So not to just stick to the luxury travel without fear of being disqualified by brands, without fear of losing, you know, brand partnerships because, oh, now you're switching to budget. And when our big luxury travel content creators that we grew up watching, when they start to dibble and dabble in different travel options, then that will open up other people. So the audience that is watching, their audiences will then start to learn about, all that Africa has to offer. It's not only, so now currently the narrative is, Africa, all you can do in Africa is the expensive safaris. Therefore, I'm not going to bother because I don't have that money. I'm going to take my hard-earned money to Europe. And that's simply not true. There's so much to do in Africa on a budget, and it's enjoyable. And I hope that with my content, that's what I do. I show that budget travel in Africa is, number one, accessible, even though, we need to work on the infrastructure because that's a barrier to entry. But number two, it is affordable and it's fun. So yeah, that's how we can use our platforms, new media, to demystify Africa, to amplify different parts of Africa, different types of traveling Africa, and to bring down the distrust between members of different African countries.
Thank you so much for that. I need to start following you. You should put your, I'm sure other people want to as well. So you put your information in the chat so we can think about how we can demystify by following you. I know on Instagram, there's something that the white guy from always comes to Lagos and he eats like gala. You guys
Chris,
know what gala
is it Chris? Is it Chris Authentic Traveling? I think
yes, or I don't know, but
yeah,
he spends like $1 in Lagos, one Lagos slum, and then so I'm like, oh man, maybe I should go to Lagos and eat some gala. So I totally understand, and put your information in the chat so people can follow you. Minifong, it's really great, but she said something that was important about accessibility, right? Accessibility and affordability, and what you're doing is you help make things more accessible and affordable as people are physically visiting, because your business focuses on accommodation, which obviously enhances free movement. So what would help your business in terms of the prospects of the company and other adjacent enterprise succeed in terms of inter-travel? Are there certain macroeconomic conditions, regulations, or things would help accelerate or contribute to your business that could help facilitate some of these ideals of the African Union's free movement protocol?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. So basically, what we intentionally do at Bungalow is that we try to open up the continent to people to make it affordable so they can find affordable places to stay. But in the course of doing that, we realize that it's not just accommodation that is, one of the factors that reduces the price for travel across the continent. The most important thing is people don't have access to places just based on the visa problem that we were, discussing earlier. So many people also don't have information, because it's interesting. Whenever I'm in Cameroon, I get to talk to people. Hey, you can actually spend $1,000 and fly from here to Kigali. Douala, Rwanda has direct flight from Douala to Kigali every day of the week, basically, and it's just an average of $200 and $500, or an average basically, or even sometimes $400, $300 to fly from Douala to Kigali. But most of the people that you speak to, they don't even know that Kigali, Rwanda offers a free visa on arrival for every single African. So information is lacking, and then when they actually get there, what is the next thing that they do care about? Where should they stay? So how can they find affordable places to stay? Not only affordable, but how can they make reservations at these places and be sure that they are going to, find this amazing place to stay at this amazing price, as well as be truly secure that they're going to find it, available for them when they get there. So that's what we're trying to do at our company, try to make sure that, you have the possibility of finding an affordable place you can book through us trustworthily, as well as, use methods of payments that are truly convenient for you, because we know there are competitors in the market that already are well established and global brands. But when it comes to the African focus, do they even invest anything in making it, interesting to them? No. So our job basically is to try to reduce the cost of travel, which is already super high because of, you know, like Tola earlier mentioned, less travel to different destinations, hiking, you know, flight prices, as well as less routes for flights due to possibly some cases you have to pay airspaces for you know, flights to cross over different countries. All of these things, you know, contributes to increase, you know, travel prices. So visa being one of them, obviously, but what happens when the visa goes through? You definitely need a comfortable and affordable place to stay, which is, you know, one of the very core things that we do here. But we're also expanding into information. Like I said earlier, people don't have access to information about free destinations with free visas on the continent. Just during this conversation, I heard someone in the chat talked about Benin making free visa for people. This is something I've not also heard about recently, even though I'm doing research on different countries across Africa. And, you know, I think there is also misinformation in the aspect of people talking about insecurity in different places, which do not necessarily exist, and stereotypes as well, which we try to break, which is the cultural exchange part of what we do. So if we are giving people access to affordable places to stay, they can interact within the community and get to understand different things. And I love what CB Poppy is doing, because I watched her video while she was in Cameroon, and it's interesting. Like, she goes to very you know, very hinterlands, I would say, of the country, and she gets to interact with the local people. I saw her working on the farm in Cameroon, and that was like, it blows my mind to see, you know, a South African. She was speaking, I don't know if it's Kwasa or Zulu, which one, while she was making those videos. And it's these kind of things are like, you know, continue to, you know, cater for the cultural exchange part that makes people tell good stories about people, know what the media is trying to tell you. And then with that, it means that if you can travel to, you know, stay at budget accommodations, which is what we try to do at our company, and then you get to connect more with people, and then you leave positive narrative on what your experience, and then you can, you know, get to share all this experience across, and continue to enhance more travel. So it would be more touching base on making sure that people have access to these destinations first, because as much as people are ready to travel, they don't, or even they don't have the information. But what happens if they get there? Do they have access to affordable places to stay, which is the budget travel side of things? And even if they do, what are they leaving? What are they taking back as, you know, experience? Which is what we try to enhance by making sure our hosts truly, you know, on point of, you know, exchanging with their local, with their guests whenever they come across. So I think these are certain things that if we do, you know, push forward with, it could continue to enhance travel on the continent. But more, it should also be, you know, not only on fact sheets of treaties and policies, but it should be more practical, instead of the borders having their own laws or policies that they enforce, different from what the immigration enforces at the offices of the, you know, immigration and all of that. So I think there should be a balance in both ways, and as well, we should tell more good stories about our African brothers and sisters. I know Nigerians, one country, is very much stereotyped in East African countries. When they say you're Nigerian, it becomes like they start looking you differently. So I think these kind of things should change, and we should tell more good stories, which will continue to enhance flexible movement of people. And yeah.
Thank you, Munifa. Thank you so much. You highlighted something that is key, because we think about a company like yours, Airbnb, as just an issue of accommodation, but you said that there's a lot of adjacent things that are important. Visa, which is the crux of this access issue. Information, which is really important. Cultural exchange, which is all really important in order to reinforce that trifecta. It's not just one, but all these adjacent industries. Now, people have been asking a lot of great comments and questions. What I would invite our panelists to do is, we've already seen that it started in the chat. If you see some comments that you think are really interesting, you can either respond to it or respond to it live. There's been really a lot of interesting kind of comments. And if there's other questions or comments, you can put it in the chat. I just want to highlight one or two, and maybe if somebody from the panelists can remark, maybe Tola or others. There's a comment from Linda in terms of a question. that says there's a large group of Linda Ocho. There's a large group of migrants moving for livelihood opportunities, working in sectors such as construction, domestic work, farmers, metal workers, etc., that need to understand how the free movement protocol can work for them, but also understand how the current system of movements work against them. Can there be barriers around that? So if anybody has, and then I want to highlight one other. Thank you, Amina, for answering the one about disposable mobility. I think that was a really good question, so that somebody as well asked. There's another question from Marvin, a comment that says that the free movement protocol could also benefit through a staggered approach that defines categories of persons that would move and the prerequisites, then do it through phases as long as the conditions can be met. Possibly also use the same approach we are using for goods and services under respective guided trade initiatives that allow for countries to opt under a guided scheme, and then see whether or not we actually have relevant structures or policies that allow people to freely move across the continent. So really good questions and comments. Do we have a quick maybe response from any of our panelists on any of those 2 points?
Just gonna try to look through them. There are quite a lot. So I think one,
and then
okay, go on, sorry. I was gonna just highlight a bunch of things. One is for South Africa's situation. One thing I think is important is to note, and I think that's a big part, changes in the law and the processes. South Africa now has an e-visa portal, and it is generally faster than going to the embassy. So I just want to call that out for the people who flagged that out. Yeah, I agree with the person who talks about political hostility and policy inconsistency. That's like a big deal on the continent. So for instance, Seychelles currently says it's visa free for everybody, but I know that Seychelles just currently banned Nigerians from traveling to Seychelles. So there's a lot of like policy inconsistency issues. And I think the FMT is supposed to like help with like that more generally. Wow, it's hard to find the questions. It's like, can you help?
It's okay.
If
you guys, what we're gonna do is, if we're gonna call on the audience to give any personal stories that they may have, and if the panelists can just look at the chat and you can respond. I've seen Amina done that a couple of times. I've seen Tenny responded. So if you see comments, you can please respond. There's one, before we start, 1 or 2 personal stories just to get perspective from the audience. I know we have one individual named Namano Brown, who works with the AUYAFTEMOPA. Namano Brown, are you there? Can you maybe turn on your mic and give us your personal perspective or experience when it comes to travel and things like that on the continent? Namano Brown, are you there?
Hello, guys. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll just make it snappy because I think we've taken a lot of time and it's been really, really informative and all of that. I'm actually the lead ambassador for YALP, that is Youth Ambassadors for the Free Movement of Persons in Africa. And we're a youth body that works on sensitizing, popularizing, promoting, and advocating for the free movement of persons in Africa. And we've been doing this for the past, I think, more than 3 years. We basically started in 2020 when nobody was talking about even going outside during the coronavirus. And it was really, really challenging because it was a question of, you're talking about movement when we're not even sure we're going to move again or we'll ever move again. So it's, it's been a roller coaster experience since then, when we established, and we've worked with the African Union on several projects regarding the free movement of persons in Africa. And we have pushed this project across the continent. And, with my experience about travels and, all of that, one of the things we discovered while, undertaking some projects, researches that we did, was the fact that people didn't really understand or know about the rights they probably could have with the free movement protocol. So I would say number one thing for us to do as young people is to push for the ratification, because the ratification of the protocol is everything. We can't be talking about the free movement of persons, or we can't be able to utilize the rights that are in the free movement protocol without it going into force. And not to scare us, but to just give us a heads up that the free movement protocol has already spent more than 5 years, I would say, regarding the protocol lifespan of the African Union, because every protocol of the AU has a lifespan, and like a 10-year lifespan, and we've already spent 5 years. It came into existence in 2018, and right now we're in 2023. And if we are not able to get it into force, we will definitely use that protocol. It will be regarded to be naturally, dead. So I think my point here today would really be the fact that we as young people need to push. We need to, speak about the free movement protocol, because if I want to talk about my experience, I would say it's pretty much what all of us have spoken about here today. So I would just do the business of encouraging us and, helping us to understand where we are right now, what stake are on the table right now, if we get to lose the protocol. And rightly mentioned earlier, AFCFTA cannot succeed without the FMP. And it will be a fruitless journey if we don't, have the free movement protocol running and all of that. So I wouldn't want to push more and push further. YAFTEMOPA will be having a space, one of our spaces next month, and we will be talking about leveraging AFCFTA for FMP ratification. And just an information for us, FMP has 32 signatories, and we have just 4 ratifications so far. And it's, basically it will be very, very, I think it will be something worth for us to know that Nigeria, some of the big countries in Africa, have not actually signed the protocol. What we have are just, some of those other countries. For example, Nigeria hasn't signed, Egypt hasn't signed, South Africa hasn't signed, and all of that. And these are processes we need to take to be able to reach the ratification. So if they don't sign, they cannot ratify. So let's do what we have to do. Let's keep pushing. And the travel experience in Africa is getting easy. Kenya has joined. Rwanda has a free entry for all Africans. Kenya has joined recently, a free entry for all Africans. And there are other countries that are, making this happen. And we need to understand that every region of Africa, I would say Southern Africa, SADC, EAC, West Africa, they have free movement protocol running in these regions already. So there's nothing to be afraid of. We need to push them to sign and ratify the protocol so that all Africa can be free. A lot of things will be easier. We will have easier movement. We will have, being the fact that migration in Africa, movement in Africa, really happens. A lot of movement happens right in Africa than even talking about going to Europe. And somebody rightly mentioned that it's easier to go to Europe than go to any African country. Yes, that is true. So these are the things that the protocol holds. These are the good things, the benefits that it holds for Africans, for young people in business, young people in other areas, tourism, etc., education. We need to push for this because it benefits us more than any other person. So I would say a very big thank you for the opportunity at this point, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Namano. That was a really great personal story. We really appreciate the work that you're doing in this area. And you did amazing call to action, which is that I didn't know Nigeria, for instance, was one of the big countries that did not ratify. So that's an amazing call to action. On that note, what we're going to do is that I'm going to just quickly mention some comments from the audience that were in the chat, and then we're going to just give a quick 15 to 30 seconds for a final comment from the audience, from the panelists, since I see some hands up, and then we're going to go to our last speaker to do some conclusion. So just some quick comments that were in the chat that would be good to highlight. One, Tanansuya mentioned how the disconnection between air transport between African island nations and the mainland causes an issue. There's a lot of conversation around aviation. Some individuals mentioned how there's not a single aviation unit like there is in Europe, and that causes challenges. There was another comment about construction, other things that I mentioned earlier. And then there's also some important resources that folks like Tenny have put in terms of what the status of the Africa's Free Movement Agenda is. So you should look at the chat and click at those for the important resources. So the panelists, can we get a quick 15 to 30 seconds final word from you guys in terms of any comments you had in the chat or any parting words you have for our audience? Let me start with Poppy.
No, nothing. I have nothing.
Okay, and just to not be undone with ladies first, let me go to Amina. Is there any final parting word you have for our audience?
Yeah, just listening to this wonderful conversation, I think what popped in my mind is that it's really important to think about the amount of money that goes into border policing and how much the EU migration policy is sort of limiting this free mobility within the continent. And I don't think we should think about them separately. So how much the EU is funding a lot of countries within the continent to keep the migrants out needs to also perhaps be a relevant point to think with, especially when it comes to the countries which have not signed. Just listening to the conversation and just thinking about that. But thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Minifong, do you have a final word for our panelists? And
yeah, I actually do. So even before you came to me, I was going to talk about making sure that we solve local problems, in local territories across the different countries in Africa. Like, many people have the conception that if you open your borders, more people are going to, you're going to have a high influx from less better countries into better countries, which is interesting perspective to look at. But also, I still believe that let's start at regional level. The regional blocks, you have the ECOWAS, the CEMAC, the EAC. So if we can already enhance the free movement protocol, really make it effective within this local, regional blocks, then getting it to the continental level is going to be an easy task. So can we, first of all, really make sure that is, because I will quote EAC for having tried to, because their own citizens can really circulate within EAC quite easily, and even they extended it to the the residents as well for certain countries to go there with an interstate pass. So I would appreciate if they look into making sure that regional blocks do have this free movement really effective, and then they expand it to the continental level instead of just starting, pushing it at the big continental level when even the local regional blocks still suffer, because it's easy to go across CEMAC countries, it's easy to go across ECOWAS countries as a citizen. So that is some challenges that I believe that if they are addressed, then we can quickly and very easily get to the continental level of this free movement.
Thank you, Minifong. Tola, do you have any final remarks?
Yeah, I just have 4 points, and I'll just say it in one line each. One is, I think that one of the pushbacks on the FMP today has been this idea that countries will lose money that they make from visas, right? And I think that one of the ways to dismantle that is to actually create data models about how much economic creation happens when you let people move freely, and how that offsets for the very tiny amount of money you make from visa fees. That's the first thing I was going to say. And I think that's an important thing, analysis. The second thing is, I think, and I said it before, and I think Mifong also mentions it, we also need to show more data, and I think Rwanda is a good case study of economic activities that happen from having free movement of people, and how it does not lead to a big surge of unwelcome visitors, right, in the countries, and the technology that you need to do that. For instance, today, the world leading, the continent's leading location for events is Rwanda because of just visa on arrival, and they make a lot of money from that. So just showing that data of also how it does not mean a porous border is the second big thing. The third thing is, I think for the FMP particularly, one thing we need to figure out is the questions of champions, right? One thing we did with the AFCFTA particularly is finding a national champion, a president who we can hang the issue around their neck and make them the face of that conversation is a big thing that we need to do. I think the fourth thing I was going to say is press. So today, there's not as much conversation happening around the FMP the way there is a conversation around the AFCFTA. And we need to use more press, use more. And interestingly, it's a more people issue than even the AFCFTA, right? More people care about this because more people want to travel, more people want to get across the continent. And so just crowdsourcing that pressure from the public is something we need to do a lot better. The fifth thing I wanted to say is Korea has this thing called gastro diplomacy, where they basically started pushing diplomacy across the world using their food, basically saying, see. And so what the Korean government would do is if you said you were going to set up a Korean restaurant in a different country, they would actually give you a token capital, grant capital to start that business. And that's why today, anywhere you go in the world, you actually see Korean food. So it's called kimchi diplomacy. I think that one of the big things that African countries should think about is and I think there's things like what we've done with Afrobeats, but what can we use with our services to get across the continent, whether it's food, whether it's music, whether it's clothing, to ensure that we actually start to dismantle this fear that exists around the continent, around how we think about access and how we think about moving across the border. And the last thing I would say is this, and this is a bit political. If I asked anybody on this call today, what's the process of actually rightfully migrating to the US or the UK? Most people know something. Either it's talent visa, we all know things. If I ask them for Kenya, most people don't know. And one thing you automatically start to see is that there's a more fantilizing of what it means to migrate to a Western country than it is to immigrate within the continent. And I think one of the things we need to do a lot better is also create information around what's the formal means for migration. And I'm not saying visas, and I'm saying relocation for work or all that across the African continent, right? Because what that does also is that it creates a route, because today most people don't think of the legal route that exists for even making migration across the continent. We know it for the West, we know it for the US, we know it for the UK, we know it for China, we know it for even Europe, but people don't think about that in the context of the African continent. Just 5-6 thoughts I wanted to drop before I ended up.
Thank you so much. Can we give our panelists a round of applause and all for the discussion? Put your little hearts and thumbs up and things like that, either in the chat, etc. like that. I think there's really informative perspective from across the continent, giving us local context of what you're doing. So really, really appreciate your hard work, your conversations, continue what you're doing. And if you guys were following them on the chat, many of them put their links to their social media, so make sure you follow them. Also, again, I want to emphasize that if you want to continue to expand this conversation and the interesting insights you had, please tag Travel Africa or AUFMP so we continue this prime conversation. So we had a call to action with the conclusion with the last personal story, and I think that we should have someone here from Marikai Africa, Tenny Tola, come to the stage and give us some conclusions about the conversation and next steps. Also, Tenny, if you could, in the chat, individuals asked about the link to the policy brief, if that's available, and we could put that in the chat, that'd be appreciated. So if we can add Tenny to the center stage to give us her closing remarks. Thank you, Tenny.
All right, thank you so much, Chime. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So very quickly, because we are closing in the next minute or two, thank you so much to everyone for joining, and particularly thank you to the Ghana Association of Translators and Interpreters for providing both French and Portuguese translation to this event pro bono. It's just part of their own passion for easing intra-Africa travel, given that it's linked to their work. Thanks to all of our partners as well. So to the EUI, the STG, and the MPC, but also to the GIZ African Union, and then to Ikoyaka and to AU Yaftemopa. Like we said, it's going to be a series of activities. There's public awareness, first of all. There's understanding things better, so understanding the FMP better. But then there's advocacy. So now those of us from Nigeria know that our country has not even signed the agreement. So who do we need to talk to? And Chime, you're great at advocacy. Who do we need to talk to get things moving forward as far as that goes? We're going to keep everyone that has registered for this meeting up to date with whatever we plan and what we do. And I think, like someone shared in the chat, if the FMP is not signed and ratified by 2028, it's going to start from square one. So the process is going to reset, and then we have to start it all over again. So there is some urgency in moving this forward. So a final thank you to everyone, and then handing back over to you, Chime, to close.
Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you again to the collaborators and partners that Tenny thanked. In the chat, you'll see the policy brief that's been requested. You'll also see again the IG handles. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you continue to follow what the organizations are doing, what the panelists are doing. And remember, the key is localization. We have our marching orders and our call to action. Our call to action is making sure that we domesticate these things in our respective locations and also understand the particular narratives that are key, whether it's discursively, whether it's in terms of some of the adjacent industries that we need to bring into the fold, or in general, how we amplify these conversations using press. So thank you so much today. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope you appreciate this conversation. Please continue to stay tuned to follow along what is going on with these various organizations, with the African Union, the Free Movement Protocol, and the African Free Trade Agreement. Thank you.